You are listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 1st of May 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The UN warns of an impending massacre in Darfur. Traditional workers' May Day protests are stopped in the likes of Istanbul, and applause all round. But please, stay seated. Why are we all giving standing ovations nowadays? I'm Emma Nelson, and the Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and a warm welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and my guests, Rebecca Tinsley and Stephen Dalziel, will go through the day's big stories, plus we'll hear why the Solomon Islands shifted loyalties from Taiwan to China. So stay tuned, all that and more is coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. And a very warm welcome to Studio One. I am joined by Rebecca Tinsley, journalist and human rights campaigner, founder of Network for Africa, and by Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst and regular Monocle Radio contributor. Pinch punch first of the month, ladies and gentlemen. How are we all doing for May?
Splendidly, thank you.
Splendidly. How about you?
Very well. Just amazed that we're already at May. Where did the first 4 months go?
Indeed, that whole thing of time being a trickster. So how is the end of April wound up for you, Rebecca? You ran into this room saying, "I've got some good news finally," and which is one of those things I think we all looked agog at you, going, "What is that?"
Well, I'm feeling particularly victorious today because I've been trying to help a family who escaped from Afghanistan in August 2021 when the Taliban took over. And ever since they arrived in the UK, and believe me, they had a horrible trip getting here, and the little boy is still scarred from where the Taliban beat him up. But ever since they got here, they were stuffed into a little hotel room. And when they complained about the food they were given, and I looked at the food because I've known them since August 2021, and, it was rotten and it contained rubber bands and they were feeding the Afghans really, really horrible food. All the kids were getting ill in the hotel. When the Afghans got together and complained about this, those who had complained and started a petition and said, incidentally, we could provide food for a fraction of the cost that the Home Office is paying, they were punished by the Home Office for causing trouble, quote, causing trouble, and they were sent to a remote hotel on a motorway, miles from anywhere. And they've been there basically for the past 3 years.
So what's been your role in getting them out of the motorway hotel?
Well, if I can just finish that, what I find ironic in my work in Africa, the Foreign Office is continually telling us what you have to do is empower local people to advocate for themselves. So there we are. In my small way, I have tried to support them. I got them psychotherapy help, because they had experienced such horrible things on the way out of Kabul. And I've been trying desperately to get them a permanent home. And finally, that has come through. And if I can just say, this was not some farmer peasant who, this was a guy who was used to every morning being picked up by his chauffeur and driven to his job at the World Bank in Kabul. And so to suddenly be taken from that really rather cushy life and to be stuck in one hotel room with two little kids and his wife, on some stretch of motorway. Absolutely brutal. Commendations
to you, Rebecca, for that can-do approach. I think there's quite a lot of that going on here in the United Kingdom. Beat that, Stephen Dalziel.
I can't. I won't even attempt. Every time I'm on this programme with Rebecca, I just learn something new about...
You have taken in refugees, then. You have done an enormous amount of help for refugees in London with the Ukrainian connections.
I've done some help with the Ukrainians, yes. I have. But I can't. I honestly can't match that. Rebecca is amazing. She's an amazing person. perhaps the one thing I want to talk about, maybe we'll talk about towards the end of the programme, it's a theatre production I'm taking part in, so I can't talk about it in the same sentence as what Rebecca's just been talking about.
No, but we will talk a little bit later on, because we will be talking about theatre and applause, and why one particular reader of the New York Times has got rather cross about people giving standing ovations. Let's look at some of the subjects that we're going to be talking about today. I mean, we've already mentioned the theatre, but let us already face another humanitarian crisis, the impending large-scale massacre in Al-Fasher, the last city held by Sudan's military in Darfur. There are warnings from the United Nations that it is surrounded by the paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, and the UN is calling it a coordinated move to attack the city. Rebecca, let us begin with you. Where is Al-Fasher? It's being described as a humanitarian hub, home to around a quarter of Sudan's 48 million people. So this is a significant, important place.
It is. As the Rapid Support Forces, who are basically the Janjaweed, they're rebranded. They're the people who are responsible for the Darfur genocide that ran from 2003 to 2006 and killed at least 300,000 black African Sudanese. They are surrounding this city, and 800,000 people have fled there to escape the Rapid Support Forces because they've taken every other bit of Darfur. Darfur is a region of Sudan in the far west, which is basically the size of France, but it is so undeveloped that there are only 6 miles of paved road there. So believe me, being a refugee and getting yourself to Al-Fasher was no mean feat. Unfortunately, what the media are not picking up about what's about to happen is that it is a continuation of the Darfur genocide, because the people who have fled there are the Mazalit, Zagawa and Fur tribes, and what they all have in common is that they are black Africans, black African Muslims. And this is part of a 30-year campaign by the Islamists who run Sudan to basically eliminate an entire racial group, in other words, black Africans. And that is the tragedy of all of this. I'm in contact. I went to Darfur 20 years ago at the height of the killing and set up a little group called Waging Peace afterwards. And we are now seeing vast numbers of Sudanese arriving in Britain. So believe me, that there is going to be a migration crisis because of them. But our contacts in Darfur have been ringing round and trying to get an accurate casualty figure. And the media talk and the UN talks about maybe 10 to 15,000 people having been killed so far in Darfur. But our friends have totted up a figure of 28,500 in one town alone.
Tell us a little bit more about the severity of the UN's warnings here. I mean, we've had the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, saying that Al-Fasher is on the precipice of a large-scale massacre. This is not conjecture. This is the grim reality facing millions of people. The language is strong enough, it is stark enough, it is clear enough, but one begs the question, what can be done about this?
Oh, lots can be done. But as usual, we will do nothing. Not least because, first of all, a really important point, it is not just the West that is ignoring this. The people in Darfur are, to quote a gentleman I met in Darfur, we are the wrong kind of Muslim because we're black. So the Arab world doesn't care about them. The Muslim world doesn't care about them. The African Union is completely indifferent to this because, as far as I can see, after 20 years of working in Africa, the African Union exists to make sure that leaders have immunity from prosecution from human rights abuses in their own countries. And as far as the European Union is concerned, all they really want to do is stop migrants from coming from there, which is, why they're piling in money. But what we could do is stop the weapons getting into Darfur. There is a long-standing UN sanction trying to stop weapons, but it's never been enforced. we should extend that to all of Sudan, and we should apply pressure to the United Arab Emirates, who are the people who are supplying the Rapid Support Forces with weapons, and Iran, of course, who are supplying the other side.
And this is something that's been raised by the United States, Stephen, the fact that the international supply of weapons to Sudan's warring parties is something which is perpetuating and even precipitating the fears that a genocide of 20 years ago may basically be repeating itself for the next month or so. The international involvement in all this, I mean, we've seen Russia's deputy foreign minister in Sudan this week. People are wading in this in absolutely the wrong way.
Absolutely. I'm afraid whenever you see a Russian official, a particular senior Russian official, in a country where there is trouble, and I don't mean to belittle what's happening in Sudan, but Russia stirs things up. This is Russia doesn't care about the Sudanese people. Russia doesn't care how many are going to die there. I mean, look at the way they're behaving in Ukraine. I know we'll talk a bit more about Ukraine, but when you see a senior Russian official moving in, that's a bad sign. And I just find it horrific that, and what Rebecca's saying now, that it's not just the Western world. Everyone's couldn't care less about what happens in Sudan. And you look at the size of the place. You look at a population of 48 million, which is going to be decreased significantly because of what's going on there. The amount of money that's being talked about, sort of 2 million here, and it's peanuts anyway in terms of aid, but also there is this question of weaponry. That's terrifying.
And Rebecca, just bringing you in on the point of the international involvement. I mean, what the picture that Stephen paints is of a war that's basically too far away for anybody to care. But you mentioned the fact that the European Union is worried about an influx of migrants.
Yeah, that's their only interest. And sorry, there are two important points on Russia that we need to mention. One is that they're playing a very tricksy game here because they're sucking up to both sides in this war. They're sucking up to the Sudanese armed forces because they have an agreement from them to open a military base in Port Sudan. That would allow them to have a base on the Red Sea from which they could harass international trade if they so chose to do. They're also sucking up to the Rapid Support Forces on the other side because they get $2 billion worth of gold a year from them, and that's very useful to Russia and to Putin in circumventing sanctions. It helps his foreign currency position.
And that's classic Russian tactic. As I say, they really don't care about the humanitarian crisis. They don't care what happens to the people. They want the money. They want the geopolitical influence. As Rebecca says, if they find they've got access to a port where they can harass Western shipping, these are the sort of things that matter to Russia. I mean, the whole thing is tragic. And what's even more tragic, I'm very glad we're talking about it because obviously we've talked a lot about Ukraine in the last 2 years, and that's very close to me. Then since the 7th of October, we've talked a lot about Israel. If you look at world headlines, those are the two things which tended to dominate the headlines. This is another enormous tragedy, a disaster, and yet very few people are talking about it.
Well, let's talk about Ukraine now, despite what you've just said, but within the wider scope of who pays attention to what and how this could be improved. Because what's been happening in the last few days is a third round of negotiations has been held between Ukraine and the US. The intention is to create a bilateral security agreement. Kiev wants as many partners on board as possible as it faces the prospect of the war with Russia lasting months, if not years. There's clearly no sign of an end to it. So, Stephen, just explain to us, what is Ukraine after achieving with the United States? What does it want?
It wants a security agreement. It wants America and ostensibly 29 other countries, 9 of which have already signed up, to say, yes, we will help you with your security, whatever that might mean. It's still rather woolly. Of course, what Ukraine would really want would be to join NATO, but of course it can't join NATO while there's a war on its territory. That's part of NATO rules. So they want individual countries to sign up to say, yes, we'll continue to support you. But it seems to me a little hollow to be wanting too much from the Americans when it took the Americans 6 months to give them the $61 billion aid package, which they were talking about and which was held up by the Republicans. And if we have a Donald Trump presidency, who knows what's going to happen then. So I'm afraid I'm rather sceptical that I look back to 1994 and the Budapest Memorandum when similar security guarantees were given by the United States, Britain and Russia to protect Ukraine's security, and look what happened to that.
It looks like a DIY approach, doesn't it, Rebecca? When you see that the major infrastructure, the major global alliances, or indeed the major superpowers such as the United States are falling short in their level of commitment. Perhaps, well, why do you think? It's because we are now working in a much more transactional world.
To be cruel, I think that one of the sadnesses of our age is that we have a lot of really third-rate politicians running countries around the world. Everybody often, compares it to the 1930s, but we do have a lot of our leaders. We know that they will always put personal political survival first. And that is why I fear that, I really don't think Putin is going to lose any sleep over this agreement. It's not a guarantee. There's no mechanism to enforce it. None of the national parliaments have ratified it. And when it comes to it, when we are tested, I have a feeling like Bosnia. Before, 30 years ago, we will probably sacrifice Ukraine.
So where do we find those promises of security? And when one sees a fellow-minded nation in need, one can step forward. I mean, NATO and the UN do their best. I mean, NATO, especially in the last couple of years, and indeed the European Union has struggled and is struggling to find itself able to support Ukraine. But one gets the impression that it would step up, despite having been scared silly by what's happened on its doorstep.
And I was encouraged recently by President Macron of France's words that he didn't rule out the idea of using that rather pat phrase, boots on the ground. In other words, sending French troops in to support Ukraine, even if they're in the rear. That is something that did make the Russians sit up and take notice. And of course, they criticised it heavily and said, this would mean war with NATO.
It made the French sit up and take notice as well.
Indeed. But that is the sort of promise that if it can be kept, that you need. And I agree totally with Rebecca about the other. Macron has shown a little bit of guts over this, but otherwise the politicians. Just briefly to go back to our first story, the only thing you hear about Africa in Britain these days is Rwanda. They want to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. Our government doesn't talk about Sudan, and they do talk about Ukraine, and they do go and visit Ukraine, and we've even had a member of the royal family in Ukraine this week. But the security guarantees. I have more faith in them from the smaller countries, the Baltic states, for example, who are in the process of signing up, and the Nordic countries. But what the US would give them, the US has finally agreed to give them the $61 billion. That's far more important. And if it does go in now, as they say it is going in.
Stephen raises a good point. If you live in Estonia, if you live in Tallinn, if you go into a hotel, you can see the German Air Force having their breakfast ready to go and patrol the sea. When you talk to Estonians, you hear them saying, I grew up in the Soviet Union and we used to get the Finns to send their television programs over us and point the transmitter to us. It's incredibly real. And it is that feeling that something does need to be relevant to you for it to actually make an impression.
But don't you think, yes, it's all very, I hope it makes Ukrainians feel a little bit better that this agreement is being discussed. But surely we should just be sending weapons. Isn't that the real thing? That's,
It is now. That is the crucial thing, and that's what's been sadly lacking in recent months, and that's why the Russians have made some gains. I mean, we're talking about on the battlefield in the east of Ukraine. We're talking about a First World War situation where there's not a lot of territory goes one way or the other, but in recent months, the Russians have made more gains, and weapons will probably put a halt to that and may even start pushing the Ukrainians back the other way to seize back their own territory. I get very hot under the collar with people who say, Ukraine should just sue for peace and give up the Donbass and the Crimea. It would be like someone in Britain saying, well, all those counties along the south coast from Cornwall all the way along to Kent, we'll give them to France, but France is actually too nice. But, give them to an aggressive power.
I'm almost tempted to advocate that because that might sound quite fun. From an entirely objective point of of view. Obviously, to our listeners in Cornwall, no, I don't wish that to happen. But it is real.
But it is, and that we're talking about 20% of the territory of Ukraine currently being occupied by a hostile, aggressive, barbaric foreign invader. The way the Russian army has behaved is atrocious. They are behaving like the Nazis behaved in occupied territories in the Second World War. Rape and they're trying to wipe out Ukrainian culture. They've taken tens of thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia, and they're now trying to bring them up as Russians. This is genocide as well. We talked about genocide in Sudan. This is genocide.
And torture is standard practice. So we're hearing. But also, you would have to be really quite naive to think that Putin would stick with any agreement he signed.
Absolutely, yes. Forget Putin and any agreement. That's just a nonsense.
You're listening to the Monocle Daily with me, Emma Nelson. Joining me in the studio, Rebecca Tinsley, journalist and human rights campaigner, and Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst and regular Monocle Radio contributor. Now, today is the 1st of May. Check your diaries, ladies and gentlemen. It is a traditional day for workers to take to the streets and celebrate their unity and to loudly voice their anger towards their bosses. Demonstrations have been held from Athens to Seoul, but in Istanbul this year, police stopped protesters from rallying. So, Rebecca, let me begin with you. And there is a slightly celebratory aspect to May the 1st, isn't there? That sort of joy of, for one day, you stick it to the man as you take to the streets.
Yeah, but I am actually filled with a little bit of sadness because I see, certainly in my lifetime, the way the trade union movement internationally has been weakened, largely because of Reagan and Thatcher, who, at the behest of their donor base, big corporations, did their best to defang the trade union movement. And the result of that has been really sad. We've had deregulation. We've also had an end to the role that trade unions once played in educating working people, in showing them about solidarity and that all things are connected. And the end result of that is that the Thatcher and Reagan people have actually created Frankenstein's monster, because part of that program of de-educating, if that's such a word, the working man is that they have sort of transited to the far right in looking for solutions because they're so disillusioned.
How correct is your assumption, though, that union membership has fallen, but are we not seeing a resurgence in the United States of unions? And we also have Biden, who is not against the unions. In fact, he has gone to picket lines, and that's a hugely symbolic gesture.
But this is very recent. And I mean, the reason I do feel sad about this, and that I think it is a tragedy, is that working people have been diverted onto things like immigration and, hating wokeism and trans, when actually they should be talking about things like unequal pay for women still, dangerous conditions at work, exploitation of workers in large parts of the world, the massive profits being made by, what are effectively monopolies and privatized utilities. Those are subjects they should be talking about, working people should be talking about. But because of what Reagan and Thatcher started, they have all these people who should, and forgive me, I know I'm sounding like a Bolshevik, but who should actually have more class consciousness. Instead, they're lining up with their hatred for migrants or trans people, and it doesn't matter.
Stephen, do you agree with this? This sort of, maybe it is down perhaps to what Rebecca said a little bit earlier on, that you don't have the brightest of politicians anymore. They're incredibly keen on holding on to their position. And so any kind of dog whistle politics is going to be a really big distraction when you're not dealing with the stuff that the people who are marching care about, and the people who are running the companies as well.
I do agree. And I think that big corporations have an awful lot to answer for. But I think there's another element to this. So Rebecca and I both remember, you're far too young, Emma, we both remember the Thatcher-Reagan axis. And I agree it started then. But I think something which has been used by the corporations and by the not terribly bright modern politicians. It is also the modern age and modern communications, such as social media. People read headlines these days, and the media, which is often not terribly objective. They write these headlines in a way that also, that Joe Bloggs, the man in the street, might sort of just see the headline and go, oh, well, that's terrible. Not actually go into the story and not actually educate himself, as Rebecca was saying, to learn more about what the situation is. And I do agree that people have been radicalised and pushed to the far right and say, oh, this is terrible, by headlines and by sound bites from politicians.
And if you were walking down the streets of Istanbul today, would you be thinking what Stephen has just been said, or would you be thinking, actually, the police are cracking down on people who are trying to cause trouble, which is arguably what you were mentioning a moment ago? Because to have your work, your May the 1st demonstration squashed, it is a significant moment, isn't it?
But this is all part of what Erdogan has been doing in Turkey for some years. He likes total control, and he certainly doesn't want people marching in the street. If I can just say, a few years ago, I was part of an Amnesty International team who went to Ankara to observe the trials of several trade union leaders who were being persecuted by Erdogan. These were not radical Trotskyists. They were very honourable people, and they really were some of the bravest people I've ever encountered. They weren't asking for the moon, but their very existence offended Erdogan and, his base, the very corrupt people who've kept that man in power.
Finally, with the time at 18:26, please be upstanding to applaud us at the end of this magnificent episode of the Monocle Daily. I'm joking, ladies and gentlemen, because for our final item, our final bit of the discussion, we have to thank a man called David English for our last item on today's discussion. He is a reader of the New York Times and recently submitted a letter bemoaning the rise of the standing ovation at the end of a live performance. Mr. English is pretty withering, and I'm going to quote for you now. "The currency of the standing ovation is indeed seriously debased. The impulse to stand up during the ovation following a performance may, in some cases, represent a kind of unconscious one-upmanship. I'm more sensitised than most people to the sublimity of what we've all just witnessed, and it's imperative that I separate myself from the underappreciated herd." OK, so who is one of the those who appreciate sublimity around this table, or which one of us is the underappreciative herd? Which one are you, Rebecca? Herd or sublime?
I've always aimed at being sublime, but, I'm in the gutter looking at the stars. I have to say, I don't go to shows, so I don't know what's happening with people standing up or not. But I do go to symphonic concerts, and I am often horrified by exactly the opposite. That you'll see people, up on the stage wearing themselves out, sweat pouring off them, giving a fantastic performance, and quite often in the audience, people can't even be bothered to clap.
Oh no, they're all going to get their last tube.
Well, they're either that or they just sit there with their hands in their laps, not appreciating it. And I kind of wonder if we couldn't be making symphonic music and operas a little bit more accessible by allowing people to be a little bit more emotive.
It's funny, I'll come to opera in a minute because stuff has happened in opera audiences. But what I really want to ask is Stephen Dalziel, the main performer among these three, of us three. Stephen, you've been on the stage in London in the last few weeks in a play. Has anyone given you a standing ovation? And why not, if not?
We don't really deserve a standing ovation. I'm part of what's called the community chorus. And in fact, I'm going from this studio to the theatre, the Park Theatre at Finsbury Park, to take part in another performance. The play is called Whodunit Unrehearsed 3. It's a money raiser, really, for the theatre, because the theatre exists entirely on its own resources. It doesn't get any help from the government or the local authority. And it's a wonderful play. It's a comedy. And
this is a great free advert. Keep going, Stephen.
There's a cast of 6, but the real attraction for many of the punters who come is that there is the inspector, because it's a whodunit. It's a spoof crime thing, and the inspector is played by a different famous actor at every performance.
Does your famous actor, sorry to interrupt, but does your famous actor get the standing ovation where perhaps you, all sweat and tears and grease paint, perhaps do not get that deserved applause?
Well, it's difficult to see. The theatre is called, the auditorium is called Park 200, so we know there's 200 people in there, and we in the community chorus come on at the end. We do a little song and dance routine, and then we accept the bows with the cast of 6 plus the celebrity. And many people do stand up, and it is a very good show. So, and also,
doesn't that irk you though slightly that you've put in as much legwork and headwork and whatever work into it, and yet ex-celebrity comes along and everyone goes bananas?
But ex-celebrity comes in, they don't know anything about the play. This is the point. They don't even know the script. They are being told their lines in an earpiece, so they've got to act on the hoof. So they're doing pretty well.
We'll give it. There's the effort that's rewarded there. So the anecdote that I was going to say is that since COVID, I go to the opera a lot, and every time there is a big number, everyone goes bananas. And it used to be a tradition before COVID that you would just sit and wait and listen and allow what was going on to unfold in front of you, and then you'd stop at half time and give them a nice round of applause then. But now we have this crazy stop-start, and then you have really grumpy conductors who are in the pit going, could you stop? We've got a job to do. Can we get on? And it's suddenly become this sort of crazy toing and froing. I mean, admittedly, people are being nice. Everyone's piling in to have some fun. But it's sort of created a little bit of a tension between the audience and those on stage because they need to get on with the job.
But wasn't it like this in the 18th century?
Yes, of course. I remember it well.
Yeah, I do too. If I could just say, I have one of my favourite memories of going to the opera, 1981, the Vienna Opera, La Bohème, with Jose Carreras before he lost his voice.
Rebecca's a classy lady,
because
ladies and gentlemen.
Well,
classy lady.
I'm really not, because, I was very underdressed for this. This was Vienna, 1981, and, there was a lot of tuxedos in the house and a lot of opera gowns, and yet, at the end of Carreras singing, Your Tiny Hand is Frozen, the place erupted. And, there was a magnificent... Everybody was on their feet, screaming and shouting. And
that's really not Viennese at all,
exactly.
Rebecca.
And I was nearly, my hearing was damaged by the rattle of gold bracelets as everybody went berserk. It was marvellous.
Good fun?
Wonderful.
Made the evening? Standing ovation. So you're on the standing ovation part.
I am totally.
If you think the performance is rubbish and everybody stands up nonetheless, what do you do?
That is a bit odd, isn't it? Well, what do you do?
I sit down. If I don't like it, I sit down. I have been known to give standing ovations, but I'm with the Mr. English writing into the New York Times. I think that there is far too many standing ovations for things that actually don't really deserve them. They're okay, but I saw a play called Hamnet in London recently, and that was one of the best theatrical experiences I've seen for a long time, and I did stand up at the end of that. But I've seen a number of other things in recent years where no, I haven't stood up because other people have. But I thought, well, it should be a mark of you've gone that bit further, you've really achieved something, and you don't always get that in theatre.
But is it true that British audiences are quite cool compared with American audiences? That Americans are much more likely to leap to their feet and...
Well, maybe the trouble
I've seen that here in London, that people have gone a bit more berserk. But if you head to, again, if we go back to our Austrian friends, you saw something pretty rare there, Rebecca. They're quite cool customers.
Carreras was at the top of his game, and it was rare and it was deserved.
I think part of the problem, though, if you're talking about the West End and the main theatres in London, probably 90% of the audience are foreigners anyway, who are tourists. So there are lots of Americans who will leap to their feet, and maybe those Brits that are there feel, oh, I ought to follow. I think that's the other thing. They will do it because they feel they ought to, because other people are doing it, not because what they've seen is something special.
If you do go and see Stephen Dalziel in his play later on this evening, forget the uber celebrity who's going to be making up their words as they go along. Give Stephen a massive round of applause and stand up and give him a standing ovation. It'll make you feel great. Rebecca and Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Finally, on today's show, on Monday, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister announced that he would stand down after a poor election result that left multiple parties claiming power. He'll most be remembered for realigning his country away from Taiwan and towards a relationship with China. Well, earlier, Monocle's Andrew Muller heard from Edward Acton Cavanough, author of Divided Isles, Solomon Islands and the China Switch, a book about the islands' debate over allegiance. And Andrew began by asking Edward about the lack of attention to the Pacific Islands received internationally and what seems different when looking at it from the perspective of the Solomon Islands themselves.
Solomon Islands, smaller countries in the Pacific for the last, forever, really, since World War II, have often been viewed in foreign policy conversations, in geopolitical conversations, from this incredibly distant perspective, from the 30,000-foot view, which often, and you even see this in articles, calls them chess pieces in a broader game, chess pieces in a grand geopolitical struggle between the United States, between China, Australia to a lesser extent. One of the things that immediately strikes you when you start to scratch around Honiara, speak to people in politics, they fundamentally know that. They know how the rest of the world views them. They know that they're viewed as sort of smaller and kind of pushovers. And instead of being insulted by that necessarily, they leverage that. They use that for their own advantage. And really the book describes that in, many, many stories. There's the Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare, this long-standing leader in the country who's sort of been in and out of politics for a long time, in and out of the role of Prime Minister for a long time, knows fundamentally how to leverage the, underestimation of him and his country for his own gain. And that's definitely the through line of the book. But it's not just the Prime Minister of the country that can do that. It's often other stakeholders, other people all across these small island states that know how to make the most of their otherwise quite underestimated position.
The key plot point of the book is the 2019 decision of the Solomon Islands to join that club of countries who have, revoked their diplomatic relationship with Taiwan in favour of establishing one with the People's Republic of China. And as the title Divided Isles suggests, there was not unanimity on the Solomons about that decision. But what is behind the argument for or against on the Solomon Islands? Are people arguing about this from a point of principle, i.e. we should stay allied to Taiwan because it is a nice, liberal, free democracy, whereas the People's Republic of China is the big bad People's Republic of China? Or is it strictly framed in terms of expedience, like which of these partners would actually be best for us?
There's a bit of both. So
thought you might say that.
At the political level, at that, at the Prime Minister's level, people in Cabinet, many of these folks have been travelling around the Pacific for the last 20 years and have seen the benefits of the largesse of a relationship with Beijing flowing into Fiji, flowing into the rest of the region. The Pacific is unequivocally a poor part of the world. Mm-hmm. Papua New Guinea, Fiji in particular, have definitely benefited from a relationship with China in terms of infrastructure investment. Their airports are up to scratch, all that sort of stuff. So there was a recognition that Solomon Islands was missing out on that largesse from Beijing. So that's one thing. But one of the reasons it was so controversial is because despite people being in favour of Taiwan recognising that China is a bigger economic opportunity, there was a deep and ingrained loyalty towards the Taiwanese. And part of it is because of its commitment to democracy, its commitment to religious freedom in particular. And you have to remember, Solomon Islands had a 36-year relationship with Taiwan, and what that looked like was 36 years of justifying that relationship. Part of that justification was, a culture that looked quite, poorly upon China and upon the CCP and upon communism. So you have entire communities that have sort of grown up on a narrative that China is a kind of big and scary place, and then all of a sudden, almost overnight, you saw the entire narrative change. So that's where it became very controversial, and a lot of people were scared about the nature of that relationship.
It's easy enough to see for a smallish, remotish, poorish country like the Solomon Islands or the other Pacific nations what the appeal is to doing business with China. It's as you've described. It's the new airports, it's the new football stadiums, the nice new roads, etc., etc. Probably the interesting question that the Solomon Islanders have hopefully asked themselves, and certainly a question I know, and we will come back to this, that Australia is very keen on, is is why China is interested in the Solomon Islands. China is not a charity, to say the very least. It is not distributing this largesse out of the goodness of its heart. What does China want with the Solomon Islands?
Well, the first thing China wanted was recognition from Solomon Islands. Solomons is a smaller country, very modest-sized economy. There's not a huge economic opportunity for China there. There was a frustration, though, within China that Solomon Islands was one of the holdout countries that still had formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan.
And everyone they pick off undermines Taiwan just that little bit.
Exactly right. But I think, there was a genuine desire for a long time from the Chinese government perspective to make this switch happen. It didn't happen out of the blue. But yet, the Chinese government doesn't necessarily have, Xi Jinping isn't sitting around there thinking, what am I going to do with Solomon Islands tomorrow? It's not the top foreign policy priority of China. And a lot of the move towards the switch, a lot of the catalysts that sort of led to that was the business community within Solomons itself, many of whom had relations in China, many of whom were ethnic Chinese and who thought that their business opportunities would effectively be improved by a normalization of relations. So there was an appetite from China to make the switch happen, but there was also an appetite within Solomon Islands that led to that too. I think often the narrative is simply that China sort of stormed in there and pushed people around and got the job done like that. There was a genuine sort of push from within the ethnic Chinese business community within Solomons, and I think that's where a lot of that relationship really holds between the two countries. There's a political relationship. There's also this quite sophisticated, quite entrenched business relationship between some of these ethnic Chinese communities in Solomons and back in mainland China.
I did want to ask, just finally, a question about the Solomon Islands, not so much from a geostrategic view, but about the islands themselves. It does come across in the book that you are yourself quite charmed by them as a place and by the people who live on them. And they're not very often visited by people. So if I give you 20 to 30 seconds to make a pitch, what's actually your favourite thing about the Solomon Islands? What do you enjoy about them?
Everyone who travels all over the world and comes back often has this sort of cliche that, these people are the most hospitable in the world, all that sort of stuff. I genuinely think Solomons has a claim to that. It is remarkably open and accepting. It's physically the most beautiful part of the world I've ever seen, and I've been lucky enough to go to 70-odd countries. This is a genuine tropical paradise. It's abundant, it's joyful, there's huge problems, but there's huge happiness, and it's a thrill to travel around that country. So, one of the purposes of the book in many ways was to, noting that people had a sudden interest in this country because of the geopolitical conversation that was happening. I hope someone can pick up the book and have a read and learn a bit about the dynamics of all of that, but also get a sense of what this place is like on the ground, this colourful, beautiful, quite endearing country.
And that was the author Edward Acton Cavanough in conversation with Andrew Muller. And that's all the time we have for today's Monocle Daily. The warmest of thanks to all my guests. My panellists today, Rebecca Tinsley and Stephen Dalziel, who has now left to go and get on stage. And my thanks too to the producer Chris Chermak and researcher George Ruskin. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons with editing assistance by Steph Chungu. For now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thanks for listening.